All cameras on the line.
Do you want that mic number 3?
Okay, hold that mic where it is. Stand by. Roll videotape, please.
I'm ready now. Shall we roll tape?
Yeah, hold audio tape for a second. Camera 2, dolly left, and let's change that overhead lighting, please.
Okay, right. That overhead mic needs to be changed, too.
Okay, stand by. How's the EQ?
I think it should just back off a bit.
Okay, everybody stand by. Camera 1 on the line. Stand by, please.
Just add a little more EQ.
Okay.
You know, I know we seem like a strange bunch of folk because we're always crying. And we're not crying because we're sad. We're not even crying because we're upset. We're crying because for about 10 years we had an opportunity to live and work with one of the greatest men that has ever lived on this planet. And things happened that we didn't understand and appreciate at the time. We didn't even know how great he was. And so time after time after time, when we heard Martin Luther King say things like this, the only thing it meant to us was, well, he's just about to close now. And it was only as we moved along, and only almost as it was too late for a lot of us, that we began to realize that this one man was changing the world, and that the world would never be the same because of some of the simple, ordinary things that he did and said. He never had a big army. He never had a big budget. The budget of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference under Martin Luther King never got over $600,000 in a year during the entire time that he worked. Most of the time, at the time of the Birmingham demonstrations, for instance, the total budget of SCLC was just about $250,000. At Selma, it got up to about $500,000. And just before his death, after Selma, we maybe raised about $660,000. But that's almost nothing compared to the amount of money, the billions and hundreds of billions of dollars that were being spent on racism, that were being spent on weapons of death and destruction, that was being spent on advertising of things that would destroy and degrade human beings. And yet, with some of these simple truths and very little staff and very little money, he was able to change the entire world. And that's why we're here. We want you to try to understand what it was that made Martin Luther King so powerful, and what it was that made his method of nonviolence something that can not only be practiced by great men in really critical times, but that nonviolence is something that's important really to you in your relationship with your friends, and it's important to you in your relationship to your little brothers and your big sisters, and to your mother and father, and to you and your teachers, and also, as I'm supposed to talk this morning, between you and the world in which you live. That this is something that works. You remember the story that Otis Moss told yesterday about a situation in Cleveland where people had fussed with each other until 8 people were shot, and yet those same 8 people who were shot, white people who were shot by blacks, by a black man, suddenly realized that they were in a wrong relationship to their neighbors, and they didn't want to prosecute the man who shot them. It was much more important for them to be reconciled as brothers and sisters. That's miraculous. That doesn't happen very often. But what we're saying is that strange things can happen. Indeed, miracles can happen when people are willing to follow the paths of Martin Luther King. Now, in looking at the problems that we face in today's world, Dr. Lafayette has given you what essentially has been almost our litany of progress. It includes, number one, investigation. You have to know what you're doing, what you're talking about. 2, it includes education. 3, once you have investigated and tried to share with other people what's really wrong, you've got to prepare yourself spiritually to do something about it. You just can't go around beating people over the head with the facts. You've got to somehow prepare yourself spiritually to approach your enemy or people whom you disagree with. And then when you are prepared spiritually, then you go to the 4th one, which is negotiation. And you attempt to negotiate with them. If that works, fine. You're reconciled and you agreed. But if it doesn't, only after these first 4 do you get around to demonstrating. Now, a lot of people say, and people in South Africa say, well, nonviolence doesn't work. Well, sometimes nonviolence doesn't work because you start to demonstrate before you have investigated, before you have educated, before you have prepared yourself spiritually, and before you have made meaningful attempts at negotiations. And if you start with demonstrations before doing those other 3 or 4, it won't work. There are also times when people demonstrate and demonstrate and demonstrate and say it doesn't work because they have no program or no plan for reconciliation. The idea of nonviolence is ultimately that there is no right and wrong, that all of us are a little bit right and a little bit wrong, regardless of what side we're on. The idea is that there's a lot of good in the worst of us, and there's a lot of bad in the best of us. So what we're trying to do is overcome what's bad in all of us, and we're not trying to destroy any of us. And that the idea in nonviolence is whether it's P.W. Botha or the Ku Klux Klan or your big sister or your little brother, you don't want to destroy them. You want to create a new relationship with them and live with them in a relationship of love and understanding and forgiveness, which is creative reconciliation. You want to become brothers and sisters with people who are your enemies. You're not trying to beat them. You're trying to win them over. And that's the essential difference in the objectives of a nonviolent struggle and any other kind of struggle. You want to end up on the same side. You don't want one side to overcome another side. Now let me try to apply that in one instance that I was privileged to be involved with, where blacks and whites in Rhodesia had been fighting each other for over 10 years. When I say fighting each other, it wasn't that they had had an argument. They had guns. They had airplanes bombing each other. There was a full-scale war involving hundreds of thousands of people. And I went to the United Nations as the ambassador from the United States. And I went to Jimmy Carter and I said, you know, President Carter, I think we can do something with Rhodesia. Because I really believe that what Martin Luther King did in the South was not just applicable to the South. What Gandhi did in India was not just applicable to India. I believe that these principles and this method would work anywhere. Well, really, everybody thought I was crazy. But they were glad to see me try to take that on. Because a lot of folk in the State Department, you know, they didn't like President Carter. They didn't like me because they didn't understand us. We didn't come up under their kind of academic training. We came up under this nonviolent training. So they all agreed, yeah, let Andy Young go to Africa. That's the way to get rid of him. We sent him so far down in Rhodesia, we will never hear from him again. Well, now let me tell you what I did. I started off investigating. You know, as smart as the State Department is, they had not investigated. They saw blacks fighting whites, and they jumped to the conclusion that the blacks were Marxist terrorists because they called each other comrade, and because they had a funny kind of handshake, and because they talked about the masses. They said, these are strange folk. These have got to be Marxist terrorists. I said, okay, let's take a look and see who they really are. Well, I started looking around to see who these black folk were that really were stirring up all this trouble. Well, I found out, first of all, that every last one of them had been educated by Christian missionaries, and that amongst the leaders, they were all preachers. Joshua Nkomo was a Presbyterian lay preacher. Dabanenge Satole was a preacher of the United Church of Christ. Abel Muzarewa was a preacher, a bishop of the Methodist Church, educated in Tennessee. Robert Mugabe was a Roman Catholic school teacher for 17 years. And he had been educated by Jesuit missionaries. And I went to the State Department and I said, did you all know this? And they said, well, it really never came up. And I went a little further and I found out that in the early 1960s, President Kennedy had developed a Southern Africa scholarship program. And they got the very smartest young people, male and female, from Southern Africa and brought them to the United States to school. Well, in 1965, Ian Smith declared a unilateral Declaration of Independence. And these students who had come here to study and get college degrees couldn't go back. Well, if you're a student, a foreign student in the United States, we don't let you work but 20 hours a week. And in order to work those 20 hours a week, you have to be in school. So they worked to keep themselves alive, and they stayed in school, and in a few years, they began to get their graduate degrees. So that upon investigation, I found that 30 of the leaders of the Patriotic Front that we were calling Marxist terrorists in the press, 30 of them had PhD degrees from American universities. One young man applied to Harvard's law school, and he didn't hear from Harvard's law school, so he applied to the Fletcher School of Diplomacy to get a PhD degree. And he got accepted at Fletcher to get his PhD, And then he got his letter from Harvard Law School that he was accepted. In trying to decide which to choose, he couldn't make up his mind, so you know what he did? He went to both at the same time. He got a PhD from Fletcher School of Diplomacy and a law degree from Harvard University at the same time. He had to be very, very smart. Well, when you stop and think of this is who these are. These are students raised by Christian missionaries and told time after time, every Sunday morning, you're children of God. My Father has cattle on 10,000 hills. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. All those lessons they learned in Sunday school, they believed them. They began to believe that they were children of God, regardless of their skin color, and that all men and women and children are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. That's what our Constitution says. Now, once I began to understand that and find out who these folk were, I started trying to tell folk. Well, they didn't believe me. No matter how much information I had, they wouldn't believe me. So I went to the CIA. And I said, do you know this? And they said, oh, yes, we have this. I said, can you let me see the briefing papers that you've done on the educational levels of the Patriotic Front? And I got some more information. It was not only that the CIA was agreeing with me that there were 30 American-trained PhDs, but they also had in their report a report from the British Commonwealth of Nations that said there were 6,400 black people born and raised in Rhodesia who had degrees beyond the university level. These were college graduates plus that were ready to go back to Zimbabwe once the country got independent. Well, they wouldn't believe me, but even President Carter had to listen to what the CIA had to say. Even the State Department had to listen to the CIA. So I took the CIA documents. I said, I know if I say this, you think I'm crazy, but these are white folk. This is the CIA. They say this. And so that's the difference between information and education. You can have information, but if the other group cannot receive it, it doesn't become education. It's just like, I don't care what your teachers tell you. If you're sitting there with your mind on Michael Jackson, there may be information taking place, but there's no education. Education doesn't happen until you learn what the teachers are saying. So I have to do the same thing with the State Department and with the White House. I had to find a way to get them to learn the information that I had gathered. Well, even after they learned it, they didn't want to believe it. Because I took the position that people with this kind of background were not just dependent on guns to achieve power, that they would be willing to have a ceasefire, and they were smart enough to sit down at a table and negotiate a constitution. And that if we could get the whites to sit down with them at the table, as smart as these black folk were, they were going to hold their own. That all we had to do was to get the whites to sit down at the table with the blacks. Well, nobody believed that the black folk would do this. They said, no, maybe they were educated by Christian missionaries. Maybe they went to school in America, but these folks are Marxists now. They got some guns from the Russians, which wasn't true. Some guns from the Russians were there, but basically the Patriotic Front and the Robert Mugabe branch, which eventually won the election, got very little from the Russians. But everybody was still believing that in spite of their American education, in spite of their Christian education as children, they were now captive of the Russians and Marxists. So I had to figure out a way to get them to learn it from some other source. So we invited President Julius Nyerere of Tanzania to come And we invited General Obasanjo, the head of state of Nigeria. And not only did they say that they agreed that if we could get Rhodesia to agree to a ceasefire, they could get the Patriotic Front to agree to a ceasefire, and they would force them, if they disagreed, to sit down at a table and try to work it out without violence. Well, it was only after we put all of that education together that we approached the question of negotiations. But before we got to negotiations, negotiations were with Africans and with people who were avowed racists. And I went along with David Owen, who was the British Foreign Secretary. Well, David Owen is a brilliant young man. He's a medical doctor who got into politics, and I mean, his mind is very, very fluid and lucid. But like a lot of people from Great Britain, they have a little arrogance about them that turns people off. Well, I pretty soon realized that he was going to come off with the Rhodesians, and we not only had to talk to the Rhodesians, but we had to talk the white Rhodesians that were killing black folk. But we had to talk to South Africa, these very same South Africans that are killing black folk now. And so I had to be very, very prepared spiritually, because I figured David Owen was going to make folk mad. Well, I had talked with white folk in Georgia and in Alabama when we didn't have any U.S. government behind us. I remember one time going into the jail where Dr. King was in jail in Albany, Georgia. And there was a fellow who was about 250 pounds, about James Orange size. And he was the desk sergeant. Only difference is he was white. And he had a gun, and he had a big billy club. Dr. King was behind him in jail, and I had to go to see Dr. King. And so when I went there, I came in and I spoke. And this guy said, "What you want, boy?" I said, "I'd like to see Dr. King." He ignored me and turned around and he said, "They got a little nigger out here that wants to see them big niggas back there." I said, "Oh, Lord. Me and this man ain't gonna get along. He has insulted me from the get-go. I ought to be offended. What should I do? Should I jump in his collar? Should I slap the white off him? Should I cuss him out and talk about his mother? Would that get me in to see Dr. King? No, that would get me killed." My objective was not to get killed. My objective was to get in to see Dr. King. So I played it cool, and I said, "I'll lay low on that one." Went on back and told Martin. Martin said, "Now, Andy, you got to come in here every day. You better figure out a way to get along with that man. Because not only is he going to kill you out there, but he'll be messing with us back here." You know what I did? So I said, "Yes, sir." And so I prayed when I left Martin Luther King's cell. I prayed all the way back up to that front desk for the Lord to get my spirit right. Now, just between you and me, he was 250 pounds and had a stick and a gun. I ain't no fool. I was not about to hit him. I wasn't even going to cuss him. So what am I going to do? Walk with my mouth poked up, and put my head in there? I came out and I decided, I'm going to fix him. I had noticed his name. And one of the things about nonviolence is you have to deal with people as persons rather than as objects. And the best way to deal with somebody as a person is to call him by his name. And so when I came out, I said, "Thank you very much, Sergeant Hamilton. I really appreciate that. Dr. King wants me to come back a little later on. I hope it won't disturb you to have me coming in and out of here." That's all right. He didn't say nothing. So the next time I came back, I took a little more time with him. And I asked him about his family, and I talked about his children, I talked about being away from home and my children. Turned out my children were about the same age as his children. Turned out that his wife was mad because he was down there watching us in jail. My wife was upset because I'm down here putting people in jail. So we found a basis of cooperation, and we began to talk. So the next time, before going back to see Dr. King, I had talked with him about 10 or 15 minutes and related to him as a person. And then by the time we had finished our talking, he came and he said, "Are you ready to see Dr. King now?" Now see, it was no longer a little nigger to see the big niggers. Once I related to him as a person and as Sergeant Hamilton, he was then ready to relate to Martin as Dr. King. And from that point on, he and I became good friends. He's still down on the police force down there. But every day I talked to him and he talked to me, and we became pretty good friends. But that was my experience in terms of dealing with people who are hostile. People who are hostile to you are normally afraid of you. And if you act like you're afraid of them, it's what Dr. Moss was saying yesterday. You're on the way to conflict. But once you prepare yourself spiritually so that you can relate to them as persons, then you're on the road to be able to negotiate. Negotiations are not very hard. Now, one other thing about negotiations, you know what you want. The most important thing about negotiations is not what you want, but the most important things about negotiations is what your opponent thinks you want. See, you might say all you want to do is sit down at a lunch counter. He thinks you want to marry his daughter. So you have to kind of get some understandings together of what you want and what he thinks you want, what he's really afraid of, and can you put his fears at ease? And that's what we were trying to do. See, Ian Smith really believed that if the blacks took over Rhodesia, they would kill all the whites and drive them out. South Africa really believed that if the blacks took over Rhodesia, the Russians would come in and take over. They really believe that. And so you have to agree to a formulation in writing that, first of all, before you can get what you want, that deals with their fears and insecurities. And once you answer their fears and insecurities and make them secure, then you have a much better chance of getting, if not all that you want, certainly all that you need. And what we needed was to stop the killing. And we needed people to sit down and write a constitution together. And that constitution had to agree not only to protect the black folks' right to vote, it had to protect the white folks' right to maintain their property and their land and to live in a land that they had contributed a lot to developing. So once they sat around the table with black folk, and the black folks say, look, we don't want you all to leave. We want you to stay here. And to be sure that you stay here, even though you're just 3% of the population, we will agree in the Constitution to let you have 20% of the votes. And then we will also agree that we will not change the Constitution for the next 20 years. Now that made white folks secure. White folks say, well, if we're going to be 3% of the population, we're going to have 20% of the votes, and you're going to agree that the Constitution won't change for 20 years, well, that's a pretty good deal. We can sit down and negotiate. And so then they began to sit down and negotiate the voting rights, the property rights, the system of the economy, the number of members in the parliament, which districts they would come from, how many parties you're going to have. But they were then, once they overcome their fears, they were then living out their negotiations. Now, there had been some demonstrations. There was a demonstration of power. There probably would have not been an agreement by Ian Smith if there had not been sanctions against Rhodesia, and if there had not also been sanctions against South Africa. The thing that people forget is that South Africa was killing people before the Carter administration. And once the Carter administration came in and we said, we're not going to tolerate that. We're not going to sell you any more weapons. We're going to cut off all exchange of technical information in regard to nuclear fission. We're not going to sell you any more high-grade plutonium for your nuclear reactors. And you're going to have to be a part of the civilized community of nations. When we laid down the law like that to South Africa, the interesting thing was that they began to be more cooperative in helping us to settle Rhodesia. We probably could not have had an independent Zimbabwe without South Africa's cooperation. Now, they didn't think Robert Mugabe was going to win. They thought Bishop Muzorewa was going to win. And they figured he's a good old Methodist bishop, and we know we can deal with him. They really felt like they could control him. I don't know whether they could or not, but the people decided that they wanted Robert Mugabe, and that's who they voted for. And Robert Mugabe took over the leadership of Zimbabwe, an independent Zimbabwe, and you know he wouldn't even let the Russians have an embassy because the Russians didn't like him and the South Africans didn't like him because both the Russians and the South Africans suffered from the same racist dilemma. They like niggers they can control. And black folk who think for themselves and who have some intelligence and integrity are very threatening to both communists and racists. And so they didn't like Mugabe. Mugabe knew they didn't like him. And so he wouldn't let them even have an embassy in Zimbabwe. Now, all of this really now is 5 years ago. In the 5 years since this occurred, everything hadn't been rosy in Zimbabwe, but there's no black folk killing white folk anymore, and no white folk killing black folk. There's still a lot of black folk fussing amongst themselves. The economy was growing at a 14% rate before the drought. And even in the midst of the drought, Zimbabwe has continued to feed itself and export food. When I was there to visit, they assigned 2 policemen to me as security. One was black and one was white. One had been with Robert Mugabe in the Patriotic Front. One had been with Ian Smith in the Rhodesian Defense Force. If they had met a year before, one would have had to kill each other. But after this process of negotiation, there was a reconciliation. And they were now riding in the same police car, acting and serving as brothers in one country. Now, my contention is if that can work in Zimbabwe, where there was an army, there were at least 50,000 people in ZANU and another 50,000 people in ZAPU. There was an army of about 100,000, a guerrilla force, a liberation movement, that was fairly well armed, that was fighting a standing army of about 50,000 whites that was backed up by a South African army of about 250,000. Now, if you can get a battlefield with almost 500,000 people on it to lay down their weapons and sit down around the table and reach an agreement that enables them all to live together, that's quite an accomplishment. Now, let's look at South Africa for a minute. Because in South Africa, there is no black army. There's almost no black army inside, and there's very little black army outside. There are not many military options. I have flown over South Africa in a little private plane. I've been down there 2 or 3 times in a government plane. And I looked at the South African terrain. It's not jungles like Vietnam. There's no place for an army to infiltrate across a border as you could do in South America. It's like grasslands. And the kind of sophisticated military operation that the South African government has is capable of wiping out the armies of every nation in South Africa south of Nigeria. Even if they all wanted to come together and come to the South African border, all of the armies of Africa south of Nigeria would not be as well equipped and would have very little chance of winning a war with South Africa, because Africa's a big place. It's further from Nigeria to South Africa than it is from here to California. And so when you figure out how you move an army out to California and feed them and clothe them and equip them, it's a very expensive operation. So you can talk about guerrilla warfare, but it's very hard to get any of the kinds of explosives or any of the things that you see in the Middle East or that you romanticized about Vietnam. It just isn't a viable option for the most part in South Africa right now. That people in South Africa have almost nothing with which to work but their souls. And in spite of what you see on the newspapers, you have to remember it's just about like it was with us. That Birmingham looked like it was about to blow up when you saw it on the 6 o'clock news. But those of you who were there and who lived around Birmingham remembered that nothing happened in Birmingham in the morning. Birmingham was quiet and peaceful like any other city. We usually had the demonstrations in the early afternoon. And in the early afternoon, between about 12:30 and about 3:30, all of the demonstrations took place right there between Gaston Motel and Kelly Ingram Park. We never even made it to the courthouse in Birmingham. We always got stopped before we got out of the park good. And so everything you saw on television in Birmingham was going on within 2 blocks of Birmingham. Everywhere else in Birmingham, people going about business as usual, except that black folk were not buying anything except food and medicine. Now, the power in nonviolence was not just in the demonstration that was going on. The power was in the economic sanction. When the black community and the white community of goodwill said, we're not going to buy anything but food and medicine, then even though they were very poor, even though they were a minority of the population, their disciplined buying brought the economy to a screeching halt. Blacks in South Africa are, the blacks, coloreds, and Asians represent 85% of the population. Even though they're very poor, anytime they decide not to go to work, anytime they decide not to buy anything but food or medicine, they have the power to stop the economy. You can stop the economy, and once you stop the economy, you can stop the politics. Now, the thing about the outside pressure is that it also puts a pressure on the economy, a pressure that can be controlled. And the reason why I've been an advocate of airline sanctions is that everybody says, oh, we can't have sanctions because sanctions will hurt poor black folk. Well, ain't no poor black folk flying airplanes out of South Africa to Europe and America. And yet every night there are 2,500 to 3,000 seats that leave Johannesburg filled and go to Europe and America. The reason South Africa is so attractive to white people is they can make a lot of money down there exploiting black people, and then they can fly to the United States and spend it. And they can fly to Europe and spend it. And most white South Africans spend half their time outside of South Africa. They make their money in South Africa, but they spend it and enjoy it all over the world. When you have an airline sanction and you say, okay, you want to live down there in that mess? Stay there. You can't exploit people there and come and act like civilized human beings over here at their expense with all that blood money. So we'll isolate you until you begin to do better. Well, suddenly, when they suddenly have to cancel their plans, when apartheid becomes an inconvenience for them, but also apartheid, an airline sanction is one of the more enforceable economic sanctions. You really can't enforce an oil embargo. There are too many ships on the sea going in too many different directions. You almost have to have a naval blockade to stop it. But every airplane that leaves to go anywhere has to file a flight plan. And the International Civil Aeronautics Organization coordinates flight routes everywhere in the world. We know out of Hartsfield Airport, we have 2,000 flights every day. We know where they come from and we know where they're going. And if we say no flights from South Africa can come in here, we can track that and we can let them know they're not welcome to land. And we can say to the other countries, if you're going to go to South Africa, you can't come to the United States. And you have the power to enforce through the Congress of the United States and through the United Nations Security Council an economic isolation of South Africa that won't hurt the poor folk, but that it won't even destroy the country, but it will make the rich folk share some of the inconvenience that poor folk have with apartheid. All of the gold shipments, all of the diamond shipments that leave South Africa, they don't go by boat. They go by plane. All of the high technology that South Africa needs and wants to purchase, it comes in by plane. If you stop airline travel in and out of South Africa, you probably have the most effective sanction that can be applied. And it's one that I think the Senate of the United States is going to be willing to apply. And I think once they do that, you will then have set the stage for negotiations with South Africa. And even though President Reagan didn't call for sanctions, he did call for letting Nelson Mandela out of jail. He did call for the unbanning of all political organizations so that they can participate in the political process. And he called for an end to apartheid to be negotiated by all of these folk. Well, that's a good starting point for negotiations. But we don't have to decide what the agenda for the negotiations is. Once Nelson Mandela and the African National Congress get out of jail and get together, they can decide. What we're doing through our sanctions is encouraging a process that basically forces people to realize that the only thing that's going to work, and the only thing, is a nonviolent reconciliation in South Africa. Let's just say they don't decide to do this. Then South Africa becomes just about like the Middle East, like Beirut. But you know, people have been killing each other for 25 years in Lebanon. But at some point, whenever the killing stops, after they've destroyed almost everything, there's one thing that's absolutely certain about the Middle East. When all of the killing comes to an end, now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 50 years from now, whenever it stops, you're going to still have some Jews, you're going to still have some Arabs, you're going to still have some Christians, you're going to still have some Shiites and some, half Druze. And whenever the killing stops, people are going to have to sit down and work out some way of living together. All we're saying in South Africa is, stop the killing now before you destroy the country. And sit down now and work out the way that you're going to live together. And if you can stop the killing and the destruction of either person or property, reasonable men and women, with the pressure of the international community, can work out a formula for coexistence. Atlanta could look like Beirut. If it had not been for Martin Luther King, Atlanta could very easily be destroyed. Because everybody black brought back guns from the Second World War. And everybody white brought back guns from the Second World War. And everybody knew how to use them. And if we had ever decided to use guns instead of our spiritual power, if we'd ever turned to the law of violence rather than to the laws of nonviolence, we wouldn't look like this as a city. And so we are now in the midst of a reconciliation phase in Atlanta. We still haven't solved all the problems. We still have day-to-day problems, but we're not destroying anything or anybody. They haven't solved all their problems in Zimbabwe, but they're not killing black folk and white folk anymore. They're working together to solve the problems of feeding the hungry, of healing the sick and housing the homeless. And that's all we're saying about South Africa. And we're saying that the only way, I'm not even saying the best way, I am saying the only way for that to happen is without violence. Violence does not bring peace. Violence brings destruction. The kind of nonviolence that worked in Zimbabwe will also work in South Africa. You could take the same parallel and apply it to Jimmy Carter in dealing with Sadat and Begin. Both Sadat and Begin were terrorists. Both of them were men of violence. And yet, the only peace came between Israel and Egypt when Jimmy Carter forced them to relate together as brothers. There was a time when the Panama Canal looked like it was going to blow up, when people thought we were going to have war to protect the Panama Canal. And Jimmy Carter thought about sending in the Marines. He thought about a military occupation that would make the canal secure. And he said, before we do that, let's try to get our information. Let's try to educate people. Let's try to prepare ourselves spiritually. Let's try to get some of our more experienced and sensitive diplomats and let them begin negotiations. And you know, instead of sending the Marines, instead of dropping bombs, instead of arming Contras, he sent two men, Ellsworth Bunker, who was 84 years old, and Saul Linowitz, who was almost 60. Two men, none of them physically strong enough to take on a nation, but mentally, morally, spiritually, they were more than a match for the process of negotiating a peaceful settlement of a problem with Panama that could have led to war. Nobody would have won a war with over the Panama Canal, because no matter who won, the canal would have probably been destroyed in the process. But these two men, with the backing of the moral power of the United States of America, were able to negotiate a settlement that provides some level of peace in Central America. And so I contend that nonviolence does work in international affairs, even as it works in race relations at home, even as it will work in your personal day-to-day relations. And hopefully, in the course of this week, you will understand how you can be a peacemaker in every aspect of your life. Because Jesus said, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall inherit the earth." Thank you.
I love everybody. I love everybody. I love everybody in my heart. I love everybody. I love everybody. I love everybody in my heart. Everybody. I love everybody. I love everybody. I love everybody in my heart. I love everybody. I love everybody. I love everybody in my heart all around the world. We couldn't have had a better individual to bring us this message of the application of nonviolence in the international arena, and to bring us this message from personal, on-the-spot involvement. And I'd like to take just a moment to welcome the children who came in and hope that we will all affirm with and for them and be aware that as they listen to discussions, the deliberations of the great issues and concerns of the day, that though some of you may think they are too young to understand, but seeds are planted. At any age, seeds are planted, and who knows but what seeds are being planted in these young minds, and that they are already sparking. Mary McLeod Bethune said she was a tiny little one when she dug her toes through the open bottoms of her shoes and said, one day I'm going to be able to speak just like that. One day I'm going to help my people. And I think about that as I see little children in deliberations like this. We have a few moments for questions. And if you have a question, we would ask that you would go quickly to the microphone so that we can record your questions. And Mayor Young will be with us a few minutes to answer your questions. And we'll just alternate sides.
Two of the representatives of the Sandinista government came to visit me there. Both of them were priests. And they said, we know that your government doesn't want to recognize our government. And we're not calling on you as a government official. We're calling upon you as brothers in Christ. And they said, we have a committee of 12. 2 of us are Catholic priests. About half of us were educated in the United States and essentially want a democratic government. Said there are about 4 that are convinced Marxists, and there are a couple in between that can go either way. We think if the United States will work with us and help us, we can overcome the temptation of people to be dominated by the Soviet Union and influenced by Cuba. They reminded me that the private sector, the small business sector in Nicaragua, is as great a part of the economy, well, let's put it the other way, that Great Britain, under Margaret Thatcher, has more socialism than Nicaragua does, economically. And that given a chance, the private sector could prevail over the Marxist and socialist tendencies in Nicaragua. I think we could have done that. But I think President Reagan got elected to the White House by convincing the American people that negotiations were weakness. He talked about giving away the Panama Canal. We haven't given away the Panama Canal. We control the Panama Canal, and our ships are going through the Panama Canal every day, and it's not costing the American taxpayer any money. But President Reagan convinced the American people that what President Carter did in Central America was weak, and what we needed to do was something strong. Well, the American people were not frustrated over Panama so much as they were frustrated over Iran. And it really bothered the American people to see the flag burn every night on television and to see the mobs cussing out America on television. The truth of it is Iran is still doing everything that they were doing under Carter, under Reagan. That the situation in the Middle East has not gotten better, it's deteriorated. America is not in a stronger position in Central America or in Africa, it's in a weaker position. But he convinced the American people that this kind of loud bluster and the threat, see, we still as a people put our faith in guns. We haven't stopped to realize that maybe those guns don't work anymore. I just got back from Japan, and the Japanese standard of living is just creep past the American standard of living. the family income in Japan is a little ahead of the family income in America. Japan has a surplus of capital. They have driven us out of the manufactured and high technology markets. Every piece of equipment, camera equipment in here, I bet, and every piece of equipment in that sound studio upstairs is made in Japan. And we think we won the Second World War. I mean, maybe we need not only to raise questions about Reagan's tactics in Nicaragua. I'm raising tactics about the success of violence anywhere. Now, maybe, violence as a means of defense, defensive violence. Maybe we do need some Trident submarines, or maybe we need a plan. I'm not quarreling with that, but I'm saying that in terms of achieving a nation's ends and advancing its interests, politically and economically, I don't think violence is capable of doing that. I think our economy is capable of doing that. I think our educational system is capable of doing that. I think diplomacy is capable of doing that. But there's a complete disagreement with the Reagan administration in that point of view.